Hey everybody, welcome to Dad Talk Today. I am your host, Eric Carroll, joined as always by the lovely Melissa Isaac, my man, Chris Gannon. Today we've got a very special guest, Mr. Gary Noesner. Gary, how you doing?
Great. Nice to be on your show.
Yes, sir. So Gary, you were an FBI hostage negotiator for how many years?
Well, I was in the FBI for 30 years and 3 of that as a negotiator.
What got you into that field of study?
Well, I wanted to be an FBI agent since I was a young kid, but when I got into the FBI in the early 70s, and when I went through agents training, there was a new discipline just coming online called hostage negotiations, and it was in its infancy, and I heard a presentation about it, and it sounded like something very appealing that sort of fit my personality attributes or disorders, as you might suggest. And I made a note that I wanted to get into that as a side specialty when I had the opportunity, and some years later I did. And through the years, most negotiators in the FBI are part-time people, so I was investigating at the time terrorism, and was also conducting negotiations when required and teaching it and so forth and so on. And eventually, as my career progressed, I became one of the few full-time negotiators in the FBI and eventually chief of the FBI's crisis negotiation unit.
Awesome. And I know most people are probably going to be here because they've seen you on the Waco docuseries that they have made here recently, which was a great drama series. We talked to Tibbs last week, but you know, I can honestly say, Gary, I have been so excited for this interview because I usually don't study up too much on the guests because I want it to be organic when we're talking to them. But I've listened to so many interviews that you have done. And one of the things that struck me is, you know, you was talking about you don't just show up and say, hey, if you don't come out, you know, we're going to kill you. You need to come on out. You was like, people want to feel like you care about them and that you're actually listening to them. And it's like, there's so much of what you do. I know we're talking about hostage negotiations, but there's so much of what you talk about that could be used in everyday life. And it was so appealing to me. Could you tell a little bit of the difference in what some of the other people might do versus your approach to this?
Well, I think the approach that I subscribe to is embraced pretty broadly in the negotiation field. Back in about 1990, we sort of made a shift away from what at the time was a traditional sort of a bargaining approach. Hey, you got 6 hostages and you're hungry, you know, you want a hamburger, give me a hostage. You know, that sort of initial approach to the problem. And that worked fairly well in those situations where someone was holding a hostage. And the reason you hold a hostage is to force somebody else to do something you can't do on your own. And so they're to get their demands met. So power, being as the authorities, we can give them what they ask for or not. So we have some measure of control. They think they're empowered, but when we make them work for everything over the passage of time, they kind of come to realize they're not as in control as they thought. But what we've really seen police officers handle primarily through the decades are emotionally driven situations, of which it's about 90% of the total. People acting out, behaving in a very often self-destructive way because they're angry at their boss, they're upset over their girlfriend leaving them, they're having a dispute with their neighbor over a boundary line, whatever it might be. And you could say that their emotional cup is overflowing, and that's when negotiation comes in. And in all negotiation, whether a hostage or an emotional situation, it's all about building a relationship of trust. And to be effective, a negotiator, a negotiation team needs to go about that in a sincere and genuine way. You know, hey, we're here to help you. You know, Eric, we don't want to get you see you get hurt. What can we do to help you so that we can address these concerns and issues you have, and at the same time make sure you come out of this safely? It's not the sort of the voice they expect from the police. Instead, it's soothing, it's nurturing, it's hard to argue with, and it's genuinely helpful and even friendly to an extent. And that comes through, and that's why people come out, because there's been a level of trust established between the negotiator and the person we're dealing with. So that's the key to it. And, you know, we do it in law enforcement, not just because it's nice and fuzzy and anything else. We do it because it's the safest way to resolve these situations. So we don't have to thrust police officers with their weapons into a dangerous situation where they have to use deadly force, or it's used against them, or they mistakenly harm a hostage or a victim. So it's probably one of the most successful approaches in law enforcement that we have. And yet it's, when you do it and you're successful, everybody says, that guy didn't want to kill anybody anyway. They sort of minimize the difficulty of it. But, that's the nature of the beast. When you're successful, it's, anybody could have done it. We've always had to deal with those kinds of things.
Gary, with you negotiating in Waco with David Koresh, did anything feel different at the beginning of you starting that negotiation than, say, previous situations that were hostage situations? And the reason why I asked that is, that documentary, that drama, pretty much portrayed it that, everyone was there on their free will. So was there a difference when you started that negotiation?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me correct you. It's not a documentary. It's a dramatic, fictional account of real events. So, as you will not be surprised to hear, there's a certain bit of Hollywood dramatization or dramatic license, whatever you want to say, involved in it. But it's got the essential facts correct. The biggest difference in starting out in Waco was the massive loss of life that had already taken place before we, the FBI, got there. So the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is trying to execute a search warrant, an arrest warrant. They show up. There's a tremendous gunfight between them and the Davidians. They estimate at the time it was the largest gunfight since the Civil War. Literally tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition are exchanged between the two sides. Who fired first? I don't know. I wasn't there. The TV series I was involved in seems to indicate ATF did, but there's other accounts that dispute that. So I don't really know. But when we come in the FBI, now we've got 4 dead ATF agents, 17 wounded. We've got 4, 5, 6 Davidians killed, a number wounded. I mean, it's literally about the worst scenario you can expect. It's not like you show up and say, hey, it's no big deal, nothing to see here. We're here to be your friends and help you out of this. Well, the actions that had already taken place pretty clearly left them highly distrustful of the government and its motives. So it was about as difficult of a challenge for our negotiation team to confront as you could imagine. And then again, you have people who have, for a variety of reasons, have sort of given up their families, their money, their choice in life, and they've relegated it to David Koresh. They believed in him as their leader and as having a special relationship with God, and whatever he said to do, that's what they did. So it's very hard. No one was being held against their will, to answer your question, Chris. So it wasn't a hostage situation, but you could say that the children were in essence hostage to the incident. They were not formally hostages, and that a lot of the people inside were not necessarily thinking clearly or in their own best interest. So it was a tough, probably the toughest negotiation anyone has ever had to face.
Mm-hmm. What was the, well, let me go back. You said that in a situation, it's a building of a rapport, building of trust. What was it like dealing with David Koresh? Because you hear on the television that he was this cult leader, that there was talk of suicide, that this was a mass suicide. Did David Koresh ever give you any indication that he or any of the people there wanted to commit suicide? I guess what was the leverage that you utilized with David Koresh?
Well, there's a number of questions in there, Melissa, but he didn't threaten suicide. However, as we came to learn a bit about his religious beliefs, mm-hmm. He taught the book of Revelation, the coming of the apocalypse, the end times, where his family of good, faithful people would perish and come back again, and they would perish at the hands of Babylon, the forces of evil. So in many respects, when ATF showed up to execute the arrest warrant and the resultant gunfire that started, it fulfilled his prophecy in many ways, or validated his long-standing preaching that they're coming to get us at some point in time. And that's exactly, from his point of view, what happened. We were constantly worried about suicide. The Jonestown massacre in South America was, on our minds. We periodically confronted Koresh with that and said, "We're scared you're going to kill yourselves." And he continued to say they weren't. But we were never sure if that meant they weren't going to kill themselves, but they would set up a situation where they wanted us to kill them. So David used a lot of nuances. For example, there was a time when he said he was going to surrender on Easter, and Easter came, and we said, "Are you coming out?" And he said, "No, it's not my Easter." And we said, "When's your Easter?" He said, "Well, I'll let you know when it gets here." There was all sorts of what you might characterize as loose interpretations that were hard for us to fathom. And what we ultimately did is we steered away from talks of religious theology, realizing that there's no way you could convince him that his interpretation was wrong. And we didn't really try to. We just said, we don't understand it like you do. We respect it. But let's talk about the here and now and working with each other to try to get this resolved peacefully. In that context, the negotiation team I led was able to get 35 people out, including 21 children. And in none of those releases were we engaged in a theological debate. So, you look at someone like a David Koresh, you look at a pie chart, and there's a thin sliver of that pie, rather, that might constitute his unyielding theological interpretation, of which you're not going to change. And it's ingrained in him. So you have to try to work with him outside of that in the much broader 85% of the pie or whatever it might be, which was more reality-based, more here and now. And that's what we've always done when we dealt with people who have extreme views on a particular topic. And that approach has served us well.
In the show, I see where you had made a deal with Koresh. He was going to write this about the 7 seals, and then they would all come out. What was that an accurate portrayal? That was something that you had actually came up with him?
Well, there was 2 deals. About the second or third day into the situation, we were trying to find, a solution. He had let some children out at this point in time, and he asked us if he could address the world, and give a broadcast. And we were deeply concerned that if we gave him a live broadcast, he would indeed use that to, settle their affairs and make a final statement and then kill themselves, even though they denied that. So we said, listen, why don't you record a statement? We'll listen to it. If there's nothing in it that denotes you're going to harm yourselves, and if indeed you promise to come out and surrender after the tape is played, then we will allow it to be played. So I recorded a 58-minute, presentation, for lack of a better term. We listened to it. We took it to the Religious Studies Department at Baylor University. They didn't see anything problematic in it or denoting a potential suicide. So we gave it to the Christian Broadcast Network, and they broadcast it nationwide. And so we were hopeful that this would give David the broad airing of his perspective that he had sought. But at the end of the day, he refused to come out. We know for a fact that the children were lined up. They had their personal effects. The people inside thought they were coming out. But David, at the last minute, said God told him not to come out. So that was a disappointment to the negotiation team. We are used to such disappointments. It's not the first time someone has represented something to us and then not followed through on it. But for the on-scene commander and the tactical commander for the FBI, I think they took it almost on a personal level. That, we did all this for this guy, and look what he'd done. Look how he treated us. He lied, he's manipulative, so forth and so on. And they, in essence, you could say they lost their self-control and maybe reacted more strongly than they should have. It would have been my preference that we keep coming back to him and say, David, we did everything you said. We did exactly what you asked us to do. Now, how can I help you? How can I convince my boss that you're somebody we can work with if you promise things and then don't follow through? That's the approach I would have taken. But we ended up sort of fairly aggressively moving around the compound with the tracked vehicles and that only ratcheted up the tension.
Wow.
In your conversations with David Koresh, do you feel that he was lying and manipulative, or do you think that he truly believed that he was hearing from God and doing what God wanted him to do?
Yeah, that's a really, really tough question. I mean, he clearly was manipulative and narcissistic and self-serving. And, you know, he was a guy of very modest means, had a learning disability growing up. But in this little kingdom of followers, he had become a god. I mean, you know, he slept with all the women. He made all the guys do all the work. You know, most of them lived a pretty Spartan existence. He had some creature comforts that they didn't have in his quarters. And, you know, very selfish in a lot of ways, not untypical of a cult leader. But how much did he really believe? I mean, I don't know that anybody knows the answer to that. I think Koresh said some of these things so much that maybe he started to believe some of them. I don't know, but
Okay.
I view his theological approach as primarily a vehicle through which he controlled other people.
Okay.
And that's my take on it. I'm sure there's others that would disagree. And I know you mentioned David Thibodeau, who was on your show. And, you know, I've talked to David in the past, and we get along quite well. And he said, well, you know, David Koresh really seemingly had this knowledge that was very powerful and caused people to follow him and believe that he had the word. And I don't doubt that for a minute. But your essential question, Melissa, is the tough one. How much did Koresh himself believe? And I wish I had a clear answer. I don't.
Right. You use the word narcissist to describe David Koresh. How do you negotiate when you're negotiating with a narcissist versus a non-narcissist? What's the difference?
Well, I think you have to speak to their self-interest.
Okay.
And for example, when we agreed to play that message, you know, why was that important to David Koresh? You know, because there was part of him that all of a sudden, this being this small player on the plains of Texas with, you know, 100 followers, now he had a chance to make his mark on a national scale. And those sorts of things have a lot of appeal to somebody that's so self-focused. And in fact, we were trying to convince him later in the incident that by surrendering and having his day in court, the coverage that would receive in the news media would be unparalleled. And that would give him a tremendous opportunity to share his views on, you know, the end times or whatever it was that was important to him. There would be no greater platform for him to do so. So, I mean, I think by answering you that way, these are the kinds of things we look at, that what will appeal to him. For example, at one point in time, he wanted us to send in Newsweek, Time, I can't remember, some other magazine, all of which had his cover on his picture on the cover. You know, he's not worried about his people and, you know, what they need. He just, send me these pictures of me. You know, I want to see me.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think we tried to manipulate that to some extent to our advantage, and we had some success and some failure in doing that.
Now, in relation to the media, Gary, from what we're seeing, there's some contrast of what actually was being reported at the time and what we're finding out happened now in Waco. When you were doing the negotiations with Koresh, okay, and the media was running with, you know, the story or the narrative they were given, was it placing a divider between you and David? Because I imagine that had to make your job really hard when they're in there listening to a radio show and don't really feel like their side of the story is being explained properly. I imagine that would cause a lot of anger and make your job very difficult to do.
Chris, that's a very interesting question, and there's a number of nuanced aspects of that. Typically, when a crisis is going on, what the individual we're negotiating with, in this case, David Koresh, what he hears over the negotiation phone, we want to be consistent with what he hears our people in front of the press cameras say. You can also say that those daily press conferences were an alternative supplemental means of negotiating. One of the things we were concerned about is when we made representations to Koresh, was he sharing this with his followers? And we were quite sure that they weren't getting much of that information, or if they were, it was filtered. Yet he was allowing them to watch the press conferences. So every day my negotiation team would prepare bullet points for the various special agents in charge to incorporate in the press conference. They typically did that fairly well. Where I think we ran afoul is when they would then answer questions. Some of them were, there was a variety of different FBI and ATF leaders that did that. Some were a lot more adept at understanding these things than others. And so sometimes there would be a flippant remark or a counterproductive comment that only served to hurt our situation. So it was, for example, the biggest example early on, it was both the ATF and FBI giving the press conferences. And you know, we tried for quite some days to say, listen, we don't need ATF out there anymore. Not that, you know, they're bad guys or whatever. It's just that's who Koresh is primarily mad at. So what we needed to do is separate the FBI from the ATF. And we told this to the ATF people. So listen, what we wanted to say to Koresh is, listen, that was between you and them. We're in here now to investigate this, the FBI. We're a neutral party in this. So then we get in the press conference and we got ATF sitting next to us. You know, it's not the message we wanted to convey. And we finally got that part of it stopped, but it took, I don't know, a week or more.
Coming up on that second agreement, what was it like? Do you actually think that Koresh had the intentions of coming out?
I think Koresh was ambivalent. Part of him wanted to come out, and part of him wanted to go out like a martyr, like Jesus. He was Jesus's age, and you know, I think when he agreed to come out for that radio message, I think he wanted to come out, and I think he got cold feet at the end, and then God conveniently, you know, spoke to him, told him not to. There were other examples like that where he would say one thing and then do something else. And a lot of that was not, as some of my FBI colleagues thought, that he was purposefully jerking us around or manipulating us. Rather, in my view, it was a manifestation of his total lack of planning. And, you know, he didn't know, he knew he couldn't stay. He knew he didn't want to come out and go to jail. So he chose, his default decision making was to make no decision at all. And that's where we were, you know, and I think this goes back to Chris's earlier question about the other thing. Was he actually writing his interpretation of the Seven Seals at the end? Because the TV movie makes it look like he just started it, we pulled the rug out from under him and put in tear gas. Actually, that had been going on for a week, you know, and the FBI purposely had to delay doing anything to see if he was actually going to write what he said he was. We were willing to wait for that. But then we were talking to people inside, including Steve Snyder, said, I haven't seen anything. He hasn't even begun yet. I don't know what he's doing. Now, supposedly Ruth Riddle or one of them came out with some stuff on a disc, but I'm told it was gobbledygook primarily. And I'm not so sure that he was sincerely working at trying to do this, or was just more delay and more indecisiveness. And I think a strong argument can be made that it was.
You know, and I see that they painted a really bad picture of the FBI in there and
Well,
their
you know,
handling.
I worked with the producer directors, the Dowdle brothers, who I have developed a friendship with, and I admire them. And they were trying to make a balanced view of Waco that has not been done before. One that shows the perspective from the people inside looking out, and then one from the FBI outside looking in. And I thought that was a good approach. They based the FBI looking in portion on my book. I was very candid, and I've always been candid. My book, Stalling for Time, lays it out pretty clearly. The FBI decision makers made some bad decisions that ended up unintentionally impeding negotiation efforts. I absolutely recognize that. But I think they also based part of it on David Thibodeau's book, and I think David has progressed a bit, but I think they were left with the impression that Koresh was far more innocent than reality was. I mean, he was a pretty dark, sinister, manipulative, narcissistic, self-serving guy, and I think despite their efforts, that didn't show through sufficiently in the TV show. The big question marks, who fired first? Again, I mentioned earlier, I wasn't there, I don't know. But they certainly made it look like ATF did. The other thing is the clear impression that the FBI started the fire. Well, there was multiple investigations, including the most comprehensive, the Danforth Commission, and they proved conclusively that the Davidians started the fire. Started in 3 locations at once. We had microphones that we had inserted into the place through deliveries that heard them say, start the fires. We had people on the outside observe people start the fires. We had one of the Davidians who survived said, I saw one of the guys start the fire. I mean, I don't know what you need. Independent arson investigation said they started it. Now, they started it because the FBI put in tear gas. But the notion that the FBI says, okay, we've invested 52 days, let's go in there and burn everything down and kill everybody. I mean, that's just ignorant conspiracy theory kind of nonsense. It just is. Doesn't make any sense. And that's not what happened.
Absolutely. And that was one of the things I was wanted to ask you about. This goes on for almost 2 months. What kind of pressure is that like on your superiors to actually get something going?
Oh, it's tremendous pressure. I mean, at the time, this is 1993, this operation's costing $1 million a day. That's probably like $10 million today now. It's just an enormous amount of money. Plus, big old organized federal government is made to look weak, ineffective. And, you know, there's a lot of pressure that rests on a decision maker's shoulders. And then you got some guy like me that's saying, slow down, take your time, be patient. We're getting people out, you know, and I was able to influence a lot of decision making, but I lost some of those battles as well. And I think the biggest problem we had is the on-scene commander ultimately was getting a lot of pressure from the tactical commander to do things externally that would put pressure on the Davidians, in essence, to force them out. As a negotiator, I know that that's counterproductive. The harder you push, the more likely you are to be met with resistance. But when you're frustrated and you think somebody's diddling around with you and lying to you and manipulating you, you know, FBI agents are human beings and they get frustrated and they get antsy and they want to do something. They want to take action. We're not trained to sit and watch people do things. We're trained to make things happen. So it's always an uphill battle for negotiators who, you know, generally embrace a theory of let's just keep working on this relationship. We had a theory called trickle, flow, gush. We didn't think we were going to have this brilliant solution that would come up. We just wanted to slowly begin to erode the blind allegiance that these people inside had to Koresh, particularly the mothers. We wanted them to come out and resume custody of their children. And that worked for some of them. They finally sort of almost shook their head coming out of a trance saying, oh my God, you know, I've got young kids outside there. I think I'm responsible for them, you know, and because when the kids were sent out, they said, we're send them off to their aunt or their uncle or whoever, where around the country. And we said, no. They're staying right here in Waco in a child protective services nurturing home, waiting for you, mom, to come out and be the mom you need to be for this child. So that was the approach we took. But again, it's a slow, challenging, difficult time. It requires a lot of self-control, a lot of discipline, and a lot of work.
Let me ask you.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So my understanding is the initial warrant was based upon a federal firearm violation of sorts. So that was the reason, I think, for the warrant. But what was the actual goal? Was the goal to investigate firearms? Was the goal to get Koresh? Was the goal to get the people out? Because these people are there voluntarily. So what was the ultimate goal, and that turned into this military operation?
Well, I think it was an arrest warrant for Koresh.
Okay.
And a search warrant for the premises based on the information the ATF had developed that weapons had been illegally converted to automatic. And they allude in the TV show that they weren't illegal, but they were, and quite a bit of them were found in, you know, after the fire. You know, they had a lot of weaponry. They had several million rounds of ammunition in there, you know, not exactly something you need for shooting coyotes in the desert. But be that as it may, there certainly is a lot of reporting that ATF at the time was an organization that was possibly on the chopping block, as being abolished because some objected to their enforcing firearms laws. So in essence, they wanted a big example of the value they bring, and they wanted this raid to showcase their capabilities as an organization. And that was the fatal flaw, because even when it was discovered that they had lost the element of surprise, they said, well, let's move real quick and get in there. But the Davidians were prepared and armed and in their battle stations, and all hell broke loose. Again, who shot first? I mean, I can't say, I wasn't there, but yeah, so they had a legitimate warrant. We would have suggested that they arrest Koresh while he was away from the compound, because the old about cutting off the head of the snake probably would have yielded a whole different situation. In fact, we were hoping that Koresh would die of his wounds, because Steve Snyder, deputy, there's no question in my mind, he would have let everybody out safely. We had a great relationship with him, but Koresh made the decisions.
Now, Gary, with your
so I think error. What?
Oh, go ahead. I'll let you finish.
No, that's fine. Go ahead, Chris.
With your negotiations, okay, I believe you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, you got 37 people out of there. Am I right with
35.
that number? 35? Okay. That first conversation about the first person who was sent out, can you detail how you got it to the point where David agreed to send somebody out, and what was your reaction? Because I know you were probably held up talking to David long before that happened, if I'm correct.
Actually, Chris, I wasn't there yet. I mean, this
Okay.
happened on, I think it was a Sunday, the 28th of February, 1993. I got a call back in Washington and was told to go to an airport where we keep FBI planes, and along with others was flown out there. I didn't get there till late that evening. A ceasefire had already been obtained, and Lieutenant Larry Lynch of the McLennan County Sheriff's Office, FBI agent Byron Sage out of the San Antonio office, and Jim Cavanaugh with the ATF, they had secured the release of a few children. As I understand it, it really wasn't much of a negotiation involved. Koresh just said, hey, I'm sending them out. And I think on the early one or two, he wanted a local radio station to recite a proverb from the Bible, in exchange for which he let some children go. So there didn't seem to be a rhyme or reason. As negotiators, I could care less what the reason is. I mean, who does it, when it happens, how it happens is immaterial other than learning from it. But just get the kids out. That was always our goal, get the most innocent. The parents chose to be there. Their children obviously did not. So we wanted to get every one of those out. And sadly, we didn't get them all out.
You know, I know you was also the negotiator at Ruby Ridge, which was another incident that happened in the drama series that make it look like as Waco was their way of trying to win back their faith, you know, and to overcome what happened at Ruby Ridge. How accurate is that, Gary?
Well, I have to tell you, Ruby Ridge happened in the fall of '92, before Waco. I was out of the country at the time. I was not even there. But the TV folks, obviously, I was fortunate to have the great actor Michael Shannon play me in the TV show. And, you know, Hollywood says, well, we need Michael Shannon at Ruby Ridge. And I said, well, I wasn't at Ruby Ridge. And they said, we need Michael Shannon at Ruby Ridge. So what happened there is fairly realistic. It was done by my negotiation partner at the time, Fred Lansley. As I mentioned, I was out of the country. I was scheduled to go out there if it continued on, but I was not out there. But the events depicted there are fairly accurate. And the reason it's mentioned in my book and mentioned in the Waco series is it has an impact on what happens later, because the behavior of some of the FBI personnel there using the sniper shot when it was probably not legal to do so, and not really being held accountable, carried over into Waco, and sort of set us up for an adversarial situation there between a calm, thoughtful negotiation approach and a more aggressive tactical approach. I'm not sure if that answered your question. And people tell me, well, you weren't at Ruby Ridge. I said, yeah, and only a fool would want to be seen as having been there, but that's That's what they have Michael Shannon doing.
I think he did an amazing job. I'm just curious overall, how accurate do you think that the drama series was?
Again, there's some aspects of it that are so incredibly accurate and truly reflective. A lot of the dialogue, they had Michael doing all the negotiations, being me. And actually, there's a team. I mean, Hollywood doesn't want to show 12 people sitting in a room negotiating. They want one or two people doing it. But the tenor of the negotiations is accurately reflected. I think he did an amazing job. We had not spent that much time together before the filming, but he read my book, and his ability to absorb my demeanor, my tone, my philosophy was really quite surprising to see. And we ended up becoming pretty good friends in the film set. And he's just a terrific, not only is an amazing actor, but he's really a terrific human being. And when I go up to New York, we get together. He's a pretty amazing guy.
I'd like to go back to a comment you made that you don't know why they just didn't arrest Koresh when he was off the compound. Do you know why that decision was made? Because it seems like it would have been so much easier just to arrest him when he wasn't there.
I've heard it defended that they said he never left the compound, and then there's other information that suggested he did. So I don't know. The FBI was not involved in the planning of the raid or its execution, so I don't know and cannot speak specifically to what they were evaluating and considering. But I'll tell you this, 3 years later, we had an 85-day siege in Montana against another anti-government group, the Freemen. And in that case, we, the FBI, led it from the beginning, and we did arrest the number 1 and 2 man away from the others. Now, that worked against us in another way, because it left the remaining group so rudderless and leaderless that nobody could make a decision. So it took us an inordinate amount of time, in essence, promoting a leader within that we could work with. But I still think the overall premise of when you've got a really dynamic leader like that, who really decides everything, makes every single decision, having waited, investing the time and finding a way to arrest him away from the compound probably would have been a wise move.
Right.
Would you say the FBI has learned from the situation in Waco? Maybe have they ever come to you, maybe in a debriefing, like, hey, Gary, what could we have done to avoid this? And maybe made changes since then?
I think, yes, the FBI learned. I mean, the FBI is a proud organization. I think on the one hand, publicly, the FBI defended itself and, not inappropriately painted Koresh is a pretty despicable character. However, we tend not to make a big public affair out of recognizing the errors we made, although internally we did. They created the Critical Incident Response Group based on what happened. The on-scene commander and tactical commander were, in essence, encouraged to retire. I was given a promotion, a clear recognition in the FBI that the negotiation team had the right strategy and approach and should have been given more sway in the decision making. And that's what happened in Montana 3 years later. So yeah, the FBI made changes. Also, I was among 1 or 2 people that spent the next year after Waco training every on-scene commander in the FBI the lessons of Waco, how you use negotiators, what you do and what you don't do to support them. What did we do right at Waco, which actually more than you can probably imagine. And then also what did we do wrong? And there were some clear failings there. So, people I found in life tend to want to see things black and white. There are people that hate the government that use Waco as an example. A big bad government came in, just wanted to kill everybody. And that's nonsense. And there's people on the government side say, well, it's a bunch of crazy cult people and they got what they deserve. Well, there's some really good people inside there too, and they didn't deserve to have this kind of ending. Life is complex. It's not black and white. It's gray and it's nuanced and it's challenging. And there's good and bad on both sides. And I think unless someone takes a mature look at it from that broad perspective, then you're just validating a preconceived notion you have about what happened out there. I mean, I did a Reddit thing here a couple of weeks ago, and 500 questions came in. I typed very quick, so I was able to answer an awful lot of them. But afterwards, I started getting all these private messages on that. People call me a baby killer and, hope your family goes to hell and stuff like that. And I said, well, they obviously, number one, they didn't see the show, and they certainly didn't read my book. They're just people that already have an idea that, which is being nurtured in some political circles these days. Government's all bad. It's all evil. This deep state nonsense. And they decided, let's go in and kill all these people. That's the narrative they want. That's what they're going to believe. And no matter of truth or logic is going to dissuade them from that. And that's just the way it is. It's sad, but you need to have more intellectual curiosity than that, and honesty.
Well, asking about the political culture, I know way back when this happened back in the 90s, the people watching the news really accepted what they were seeing, what the narrative that the news was giving them. They accepted that. It wasn't until recently that the whole Waco incident has resurfaced now with the docuseries and documentaries and whatnot. So given the political culture, we have some, corruption perhaps on part of the FBI. How much do you think that factors into people now looking back and say, wait a minute, the FBI probably did do something wrong?
It probably is a big factor. I mean, I on my personal level, I've been retired for 13 or 17 years now. I mean, I can't speak with any personal experience about what's going on now, but I tend to think so much of the current criticism of the FBI is unfounded and flat out wrong, and it's just propagated for pure partisan political reasons. And I understand that, but it doesn't make me feel any better about it. But no, I think you're absolutely right. I think people are maybe looking at it through today's lens. There's been about, I don't know, maybe 8 documentaries about Waco since 1993. The first several years, the FBI had a gag order. We weren't allowed to do any interviews, to go on any TV shows, to participate in any documentaries. So some of those early ones, there's one called Rules of Engagement, that's pure crap. I mean, it's just bogus. It's just nonsense. There have been some documentaries in more recent years that are much more reality-based and show a balanced approach. CNN did a wonderful one, Faith, Fear, and Fire. BBC did a good one. So there's been a number of them that have come around. But you're right. I think this resurgence, this TV show, Paramount Network, came out 2 years ago. We didn't get this kind of controversy. But now, with 2 years of political nonsense going on in the country, I think sadly it was ripe to feed into the narrative that some people want to believe. So yes, I think it has a very big impact on how people view it now.
Gary, how many hostage negotiations have you gone through in your career? And the reason why I'm asking that is because I'm wondering if the FBI, after you negotiate for a hostage, ever allows you to follow up with the person you're negotiating with, to see their frame of mind, maybe if they're in jail, or does that research, do they allow you to continue that research? And if they do, if you've been able to communicate with people who had hostages afterwards, how did their perception change from when you were negotiating with them to after?
There's no policy that dictates doing that or not. And it happens somewhat on an informal basis. If you read my book, there's a very harrowing case, the first chapter, and it's in Sperryville. I'm still in touch with the victim, the lady who was abducted there. I mean, we're Facebook friends, and and the Montana Siege, the guy that we promoted to become the boss that was absent inside, Edwin Clark and I are in touch on Facebook. It's not very common, to be honest with you, because we try to separate out our lives from what I'm doing professionally here and now to resolve this versus, starting a lifelong relationship. But occasionally that does pop up, and when appropriate, I don't have a problem with that. But I want to answer your question. When we have gotten feedback from people we've negotiated out, the perpetrator, for lack of a better term, what we always hear, we ask them, what made you come out? What did I say? What did the negotiator say? And the answer is always the same. I don't know what you said, but I like the way you said it. And I stopped to think about that. It's a really powerful testament about your tone and your demeanor. Do you come across as a caring, trustworthy, helpful person that will deal with them honestly. That's what gets people to put down their weapon and not hurt themselves or someone else. And that's what a negotiator has to do. And of course, we're fortunate, we're working in a team context. I might, on a occasion, be the voice of the team, but there's 6, 7 other negotiators maybe sharing their ideas, their assessments, their recommendations. So we rise or fall as a team. But, you know, our goal is always to get out everybody alive that we can, and that includes the perpetrator. And I think that's one of the most noble things in law enforcement. And we have a very high, in the 90 percentile success rate. But yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question, Chris, but give it a shot.
So in the docuseries also, it showed you having a lot of success in negotiating with David Koresh and getting people out. At some point, the decision was made to pull you off as negotiator. Why was that made? And it seems after that, everything kind of went downhill.
Well, it happened very dramatically in the TV show, and it happened near the end. In reality, it happened at the halfway point. We rotate personnel from those long situations on a 3-week basis.
Okay.
So I was there 5 weeks, and I was seen as an impediment to more aggressive external action. And I'm guilty of that charge. I was an impediment to that kind of behavior. So they decided that this little trickle of people coming out was taking too long. So we'll be here till Christmas, you know. And so they decided they wanted to bring somebody in that they felt would be amenable to a more aggressive approach. And they did. And of course, no one else came out for the remaining second half of the incident, other than on the final day of the fire when 9 people survived the fire, some of whom we believe were fire starters, by the way. But that's a different story. But yeah, it goes to show you that, you know, again, this whole thing, I told the on-scene commander when I left that we had 7 people out on the, I think it was the 23rd of March, 2 days before I left. 7 adults. It was the biggest day we had ever had, the most successful. And in reaction to that, the armored vehicles went forward and crushed some cars. So I tried to explain to the boss, you're teaching your dog to bring you the newspaper. And when you do, you kill the dog. Well, the dog is going to figure out pretty quickly that bringing you the newspaper is not exactly in his best interest. You reward positive behavior, you don't punish it. And when we did that on that day, that again, I think it was the 23rd, we pretty much ended negotiations. Koresh said, that's it, nobody else is coming out. And I told the boss, I don't think anybody else is coming out. And they didn't.
Gary, what was it like speaking out about some of the things that you would have done different? Did you find it well received, or did you receive any criticism from your peers?
Not a lot of overt criticism, but I'm clearly, whistleblower is way too strong a word, but I've probably been the voice that's been the most outspoken critic of the FBI, and that never wins you friends in any organization. Yeah. But here's my reason for doing it. I mean, I feel very passionately about negotiations, about managing a crisis in the most peaceful manner we can. I believe in the philosophy of we use force, not because we can, but we only use force when we're left with absolutely no alternative, when the actions and behavior of the perpetrator leave us with no choice. They're about to kill somebody, or, you know, they'd be turning violent. We should be able to look at the public and say, we went in when we did, and sadly it didn't end well, but here's why we did it. He left us no choice. That's the criteria we have to make. We don't go in just because we got tired, we got hungry, we're impatient, it's taking too long. The reason I wrote my book, the reason I've been in these documentaries, the reason I agreed to do the TV show and be part of that, was my belief that current and future FBI leaders need to understand what we did right and what we did wrong. The old saying about those who don't learn from history are destined to repeat it.
Now, you said halfway through is when you left the negotiation. Where were you when that siege went down? And were you watching it live on TV? And what feelings were you going through?
Yeah, it was kind of a busy time in my life. I left Waco and I went overseas on something completely different. I'm on the phone every day with the negotiation team, even from overseas. I come back and my boss says, listen, because he had told me previously I might be going back to Waco. I came back and he said, listen, don't go to Waco, come to FBI headquarters tomorrow. They're going to put in tear gas, and I want you to be at the command center at FBI headquarters. So that's what I did. And they also said, oh, and then tomorrow you're flying to the Lucasville prison incident, which was a prison hostage situation going on in Southern Ohio. So I went to headquarters and I was watching on the screens that everyone else was, and I saw the place, you know, eventually start on fire after the tear gas operation began. And as it became clear that no one was coming out, I just got up and left. I was so angry, particularly at David Koresh. But I was also angry at some of the earlier decisions that I think really prevented us from having been able to pursue a strategy that I believe would have gotten a lot more people out, maybe everyone. Now, a lot of my colleagues don't like to think that we did something that caused death. So they say, well, it was going to end that way no matter what. Well, I don't believe that. I don't believe it was inevitable. And I don't believe we got everybody out we could, which is my criteria. I'm not saying everyone has to come out, but we have to get out everybody that's possible to get out, and we didn't. So after that, I flew to Lucasville the next day and spent some days there and resolved that situation peacefully. So those were kind of busy days in my life, and my family certainly paid a price for that.
We're coming to the near the end of the interview, and I definitely want to ask you about your book and let everybody know where we can get that. But as this hostage negotiator and you're doing this, what is it like when you've worked so hard on a case and you've done everything you can do and you don't get the results that you were looking for?
Well, it's really disappointing, and to say the least. I've always gotten by in my career. You've heard of the serenity prayer, the prayer that says, let me understand the things I can change and understand the things I can't and appreciate the difference. I mean, those are my words, but that's essentially what it says. It's basically a recognition of your limitations. There are things you can change in the world, there's things that you can't. You do your very best job and you give it your all. I've never been one to second guess myself, because I don't, if I had not made some comments to the bosses and questioned and challenged some of the decisions made, I probably would feel guilty, but I don't. I did tell them, and I'm sorry I wasn't more successful. I was on occasion, but I did the best I could. I don't question or view myself as having failed. I've been asked this before about Waco. It is both the proudest moment in my FBI career and the saddest, because the negotiation team I assembled, fighting against incredible odds, the death and destruction that had already taken place before we started negotiation, the erratic decision-making by our bosses, the complete narcissism of David Koresh. I mean, you just could not assemble a more difficult set of circumstances, yet we prevailed in saving 35 people. I could not be more proud of the talents of that negotiation team. On the other hand, the outcome is so sad and tragic, and not only to the people involved, but I wanted to be an FBI agent since I was 8 years old. I mean, I love the FBI. And it hurts me to know that we didn't perform at the level we know how to. In fact, people ask me, what did you learn from Waco? I said, we learned in the FBI to do what we'd been doing before Waco. I mean, the FBI had a long history of resolving significant events very peacefully. We led the world in the philosophy and the training on this endeavor, and yet we, in this instance, did not listen to our own playbook and at the decision-making level. So all those feelings come through. And I went through a little bit of a hard time psychologically after Waco, but, you know, I bounced back, and that's how come I got this, you know, old wrinkly face, and, you know, get by best I can.
It's got to be difficult that people look at Waco and they say, oh, this was a failure by the FBI, and kind of lump you in with that, when a failure for your work would have been nobody comes out. And you got 35 people to come out. So in my eyes, that's a success. Like, there's got to be two different stories there. Do you ever feel discouraged by that? You're like, hey, I saved 35 people.
Well, it's both a partial success and a partial failure. I mean, certainly a partial success for the negotiation team and a partial failure for the FBI decision making. But yeah, I think it's tough. It's tough to deal with these things. And I just had another train of thought I was going to tell you, and it slipped my old pea brain here. But yeah, I mean, I think you know, all of these cases are opportunities to educate and to learn, and you know, that's what's really important. That if you make mistakes or some things were done not right, if we don't learn from it. I mean, I watch our national political discourse and I'm aghast. I mean, I think people seem not to have learned anything about cooperation on both sides of the aisle. Just the ignorance is beyond comprehension for me, but it is what it is.
Absolutely. Well, Gary, tell us about your book and how our followers can find it and how they can get it.
Well, my book came out in 2010. It's called Stalling for Time: My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator. It was published by Random House, now Penguin Random House. It was in hardback and ebook for the first, up until 2 years ago. And then with this TV show coming out, they also released an audiobook, which I read, and in paperback. Now, I learned from some folks that the sales over this TV premiere on Netflix have just wiped out the book supplies, and Random House tells me that shipments are on the way to the Amazon distribution points as we speak. I'm not sure exactly when they'll come in, but they should come in very soon. And someone told me Barnes and Noble has it, but I don't know. But yeah, it's only in paperback now if you want a physical copy of it. But it talks, Waco's the largest chapter, but it certainly talks about a lot of the other cases I worked in my career and some of the things I learned about human behavior and influence and creating relationships. Thank you for asking.
Yes, sir. And I think there, you know, I wish we'd have had a little bit more time, because there's so much that you was talking about. People want to be heard. They want to feel like you understand, that you care. I'm talking about the political discourse that we've got going on today. People don't listen to each other anymore. They talk to be right. And I feel like it's the destruction of our nation right now. And there's so much, again, that could be applied. I've so much enjoyed listening to all of your interviews, and I thank you for your hard work that you did there. And thank you for coming to this show. If everybody wanted to keep up with you, Gary, where can they find you?
Well, again, you can read I have a website, www.garynoesner.com. I've got a page on Facebook, Stalling for Time. I'm on LinkedIn. I'll answer any friend request on LinkedIn. On Facebook, and other close friends. I mean, I've just gotten so many inquiries the last couple of weeks. It's just amazing. I'm sometimes a little bit surprised that this story still resonates so much. And maybe it goes back to what Melissa was saying before about the current state of play has some impact on that and how people view it. But, you know, I'll just leave with one comment about the FBI. It's never been a perfect outfit. It's far from it. But, you know, even the on-scene commander and the tactical commander, whose decision-making I disagreed with, even they wanted a peaceful outcome. They just, in my judgment, didn't know how to go about doing it the right way. But their intent was good. Because things always don't turn out the way you want. Don't assume that there's this sinister cabal of people that are trying to take away your rights and abuse you. I mean, the FBI has got some of the most dedicated, hardworking people in the world, always has. And I'm so proud to have spent 30 years of my life in that organization. So, you know, be a little judicious in your criticism. You know, things aren't all black and white. They're not all good. They're not all bad. Be mature enough to realize that life is a complex thing and, act accordingly.
Absolutely. Well, Gary, thank you so much for coming, my man. And everybody, if you haven't seen the drama series, please go check it out and please go get a copy of that book. I'm definitely looking forward to getting my copy. So,
Very
hey,
good. I'm glad to
appreciate it
be
again.
with you all today. Chris, Melissa, Eric, be good.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, sir.